Hey everyone, today we'll be doing a hands-on, real-world introduction to the core building blocks of modern authorization. We will add authorization to a platform for meme connoisseurs. We won't be going into advanced enterprise setups here. Instead, we're keeping it grounded and useful. We're going to talk about the basics that actually matter when you're shipping an app with user roles and permissions. There are a few things that you're going to learn today. First of all, you're going to learn how to plug in Auth0 for authentication and how to auto-sync users into Permit.io. Secondly, you're going to set up role-based access control across multiple tenants. Thirdly, you're going to work with the permits policy decision point, otherwise known as the PDP. It's a microservice that you launch locally and it acts as your policy engine, evaluating all the access decisions based on the rules you configure in your policies and in the no-code UI policy editor. And finally, we're going to wire up some roles, resources, tenants, and create our very first policy that then we're going to use inside of the application. There is a few things you'll be learning how to configure. We'll create two roles, a viewer and a member. We're going to be working with two different resources, a meme and a start meme, and their corresponding actions. And finally, we're going to create 4 different tenants: cat memes, dog memes, funny memes, and random memes, which will act as the groups we can access by a single user, but with different permissions. Now, to clarify, we're not building everything from scratch. That would take way too long and you guys would hate it. Instead, we'll be using an app I have pre-built with the full GitHub repo being available in the description down below. I really highly suggest that you clone it, you run it, and you follow along with the app live on your laptop. So first, we'll start by jumping into a full demo of the project so you know exactly what we're going to be building. As I walk you through the app, I'll call out exactly where authorization happens so you can get your thinking brain on and where those enforcement points are. And once we have a basic understanding, we'll go ahead into the permit no-code UI and set up our policy. So let's jump right into the demo. What you can see in front of you is the Auth0 login. This is the authentication provider we have integrated with our application, and it works seamlessly with Permit, as any other authentication provider that has some kind of unique identifier for the user, which is pretty much all of them. Now, in this case, we're going to be using Auth0, and I'm just going to log in with Google. So I'm going to log in with a social media platform. I'm going to log in with my philip@permit.io email. And as you can see, we land on the home page of the app. Now, let me explain what you can see in front of you. First of all, you can see the meme categories. This is the different types of categories of the memes that the user can view once they register. Like I said, we have cat memes, dog memes, funny memes, random memes, and these will be acting as a separate tenant in our application. And I'll show you that right now. I'm going to navigate into the Permit no-code UI. I'm going to go into directory. And as you can see, this is the user that I have signed in. As soon as we sign in with the user, we get issued our own user unique identity, some user details, and a basic viewer role. That's the role that everyone gets as soon as they sign up. Now, with the tenants, we have 4 different tenants plus the default tenant. The default tenant always exists, and the other tenants are representative of the different meme categories that we can go into. Now, as you can see, we have a cat memes tenant with the same user, with the same role, with the same key. We also have a dog meme, a funny meme, and a random meme tenant. It all looks exactly the same, but you'll see how it works in just a second. Let's go back to the app and let's also talk about the start memes. Now, as soon as we access a specific collection, let's say that today I really like dog memes. Now, we can see some dogs here. Now, as you can see, because we're not a member of the group, we're only limited to viewing 3 of those memes. And as a non-member, if I try to, for example, give a thumbs up to the meme, well, I don't have the permissions to do so. And this is one of the enforcements that we're controlling. But also, if I try to start a meme, we can do that because that's a thing that we are allowed to do based on the policy we're going to configure. And this is also an enforcement. And also, the amount of memes that get returned from the API is also another enforcement on top of that. Now, if I actually go back, you'll notice that every time we start a meme, it actually appears under our start memes here. Now, let me show you something really interesting. Let's go back into dog memes And here we have the free memes. And let me navigate into our dog memes tenant. And what you'll notice is here that we are a viewer. Now, when I join as a member, my permissions will change. I should have now access to more memes. So let me go ahead and do that. I'll join as a member, I'll join the group, and suddenly you'll see that the page refreshes and we now have access to all the dog memes in that group. Don't rinse me, these are not all dog memes. I've used the basic API to pull random memes. I haven't segregated them. This is just for visual purposes and for demo purposes. But let's just assume these are all dog memes, all right? Now, as soon as I've joined this group, first of all, we now get some UI changes that we are a member of that group based on the specific role that we understand from permit. But also, if I go back into the dog memes and I'll just refresh this page, you'll notice that our user inside of dog memes have now been given an additional role. Now, these two roles, and a user can have multiple roles in permit, but we have been given this additional member role, which gives us additional permissions to do things. In this case, to view all the memes. And also, if we go back into the UI, you'll notice that we can now, if I try to, we can upvote this specific meme as well. So this is essentially most of the app. But there's one more thing that I want to show you. What if we actually join as a new user? Well, if I log out of this application and I'll create a new account, I'll go to sign up and I'll say pokey@permit.io. And here I'm going to type in a password. I'll continue. It'll ask us if we want to share some information. We do. And here we go. We get a new account saying, hey, welcome pokey@permit.io. You can see that Auth0 authentication is working. We're successfully logged in. And if I go back into my default tenant, you'll notice that we have a new user that has synced. We have Pokey inside of the default tenant as a viewer. And we also have Pokey inside all the other tenants as well. So we automatically sync it to all tenants. I think one thing I didn't mention though is that in our dog memes, the group that we have joined, you can see that Philip, which is myself here, I have the member role, but if I go to a different tenant, for example, cat memes, I do not have that member role. So the same user can exist in multiple tenants, but they might have a different role and therefore different permissions per tenant. And that gives you much more flexibility when it comes to building and working with basic RBAC permissions. Now, I think that gives us a really nice overview of the app. So the next thing I want to do is jump into the permit no-code UI, create these 4 tenants and show you how to do it, create the roles, create the resources, create the actions on those resources, configure the policy, and then we'll be back to the same stage we were at. And then we'll jump into the code and I'll show you different places where I created the permission checks to control those enforcements of the code. All right, let me show you how quickly and easily you can actually create a whole policy inside of the permit no-code UI. Now, as you can see, we're back to basics, nothing in our policy. I'm inside a directory. I only have one tenant. It's the default tenant. That's one you get by default when you create a new project. And if we go into our policy, there is no policy, we have no resources, and we have no roles. So I'd suggest that we actually start with creating some resources. So we need 2 resources as part of this app. We need a resource called a meme. And the permissions on that meme, we should be able to like a meme, dislike a meme, and view all the memes. That's the 3 actions that we're going to have on this. And we can just save. So that's the first resource created. Now we need to create another resource. The other resource is called a starred meme. And here, the permissions for the starred meme will be that we can star a meme, of course. We can unstar a meme. And we can view the starred meme. And we can save. So as you can see, we have 2 resources with their corresponding actions. Now we need to create the roles. These are default roles, so we don't need these. We're going to create our own, so I'm just going to delete them. Permit by default generates 3 basic roles that are most commonly used. But in this case, we're going to be working with 2 roles. And the first role is going to be the viewer, like so. And we can save that role. And the next role is going to be the member. And we're going to save that role. So we have our resources, we have our roles, And now we can actually go into our policy editor and create our policy. As you can see, when you create your resources and roles, the policy gets rendered like this. You can also have it in a grid view if you prefer that. I like working with the roles being separated. And in this case, we're saying, okay, so as the viewer, so the basic role we're going to assign to each user as soon as they get synced into the application and become a member or become a user of the meme Connoisseur app, we want them to be able to star memes, unstar the memes, and view the basic memes. And we can save those changes. And that gets saved, and the policy that we're running will already understand this. Now, for the member role, we want to say that, well, I want the member role to be able to like and dislike memes. And also, as soon as I become a member, I need to be able to view all the memes. So we can save those changes. So we've got our policy in place. The last thing we actually need to do is just create the different tenants. Create a tenant for each one of the different categories of memes that we'll be able to access. So we can navigate to the directory, we can navigate to the settings, and here we can manage our tenants. And inside of managing the tenants, we can add new tenants. And the first tenant that I'm going to add, I'm going to call it cat memes. And therefore we can add the tenant. And as you can see, it populates the name and the key. Then we'll have dog memes with a capital, like this. We'll have funny memes. And we'll have random memes. All right. And we have created our 4 different tenants. So if we just close this now, you'll see that we have access to those different tenants. For example, cat memes right there. And now let's create our first user so it actually appears in this app. So I'm going to go back into our application. I'm going to sign in with Google. And I'm going to sign in with Philip at Permit.io. This user does not exist currently in Auth0, so it's going to be created. And I'll accept, and I'll give all my details across from my Google account. And as you can see, welcome, Philip Grabowski. Your account has been successfully set up. And if we go back into Permit and we'll refresh any of the memes, you'll notice that my name actually comes in and gets synced directly into here with my unique user ID and the initial viewer role that we have at the start. And that name and my user ID will appear in all of the 4 different tenants. So now you might be asking, all right, this setting up in Permit, this has been the easy part. Where's the complicated part? There isn't really much of a complicated part. The last thing that I've got to show you is how we run the PDP and how we launch Permit inside of the application. So how we launch the object and pass in our API key. And then I'll show you where we create our enforcement points to be able to sync the user and then to check against all the different parts of the enforcement within the application. So without any further ado, let's move on to that section. Now, the initial part of the coding implementation is actually setting up Auth0 and syncing that user into Permit. Now, some of you may be thinking, wait, Auth0, doesn't Auth0 support RBAC in multi-tenancy? And it's the right question to ask. It absolutely does. But because Auth0 is an authentication vendor, they haven't put much focus on how these permissions are controlled and how flexible they are with authorization. Now, Auth0 is a solid choice for authentication. It handles login, SSO, and identity management really well. And yes, it can manage a few basic roles. But that's where it stops. Auth0 isn't extensible when it comes to authorization. The moment you need tenant-aware roles, permissions tied to specific resources, or dynamic access logic, you're forced to hard-code it all in your backend, and we don't want that. That quickly becomes brittle and very unmanageable. It also can't give non-technical users any way to view or control access. And there is no audit trail or visibility for security reviews. That's why I always suggest starting with Permit. It's a far better initial decision to make, especially if the app is going to grow. Because as soon as you grow out of basic RBAC, and it happens very, very quickly, trust me, then you're going to have to think of changing authorization from Auth0. So it's not really the best choice to go with, and Permit most definitely is. All right, so how do we start working with Permit? Well, the first thing you need to do is install the Permit NPM package, which you can see right here. Now that package will allow you to make use of permit. And then the first thing, as soon as that package is installed, is initializing the permit SDK and the object. Now here I have a file called permit. It's under my library. And I'm importing permit from permit.io, and I'm initializing the PDP and the SDK. I'm specifying the URL of the PDP, and I'm passing in my token, my API key. Now, by the time you see this key, it's going to be rotated, so there's no point trying to make it work. But you pass in this API key that you can get from the dashboard, and I'll show you. When we go back to permit, the no-code UI, when you go back into our permit app, you'll be able to just click on your profile here, and you can copy the environment key. This is the key that you're going to be using to run the PDP. So as soon as we initialize this project, we also need to run the PDP, because any permission check that we implement and then we want to test, if the PDP isn't running, all the checks will be failing, and we don't want to come across that problem. So also, as part of this setup, I'm going to launch my PDP. So I copied my API key. This is the command that we need to be running. And here where it says your API key, you want to just replace it with the API key that we have copied. And as you do that and press enter, you'll notice that the PDP actually launches, and it will be ready to evaluate all the decisions that are coming its way. So now let's talk about the syncing of the user. What do we mean by syncing of the user? Or in other words, what is that handoff point between the authentication solution and the authorization platform like Permit? Well, as soon as a user logs in, all that data has to be accumulated, and it has to be dynamically passed into Permit for Permit to register that user, create that user, and assign all necessary roles that the user should have as soon as they log in for the initial first time. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, how do we know if the user has logged in for the first time? Well, I'll show you the implementation. If I go into app here, and then into our API and into our auth folder, you'll see that I have a sync user folder with a root. And let's very quickly run through this root. Here I'm exporting a function, and this is the function that will allow us to essentially sync the user. The first thing you do is we fetch the session from Auth0. So as soon as the user logs in, but before displaying the UI to him, we already have access to the session object, which means we already have access to his unique ID, which we need, any sort of information like name, surname, or any other kind of metadata associated with that user. And that is the information we actually need to create the user within Permit. Then we perform some basic data extractions, so the whole user from the session, and then the specific user ID. And then we perform some checks. So we check if this user is already an existing user. We call the Permit API to get the user with the user's ID that we got from the session. And we check, does this user exist? Is he already in Permit? If that comes back as no, he's not in Permit, then we proceed to actually run the sync user function. And you'll be able to see that right here. We run a synced user function by calling await permit.api.syncUser. We pass in the key, we pass in the first name, the last name, the email. For the time being, this is just the basic information we do. If you're dealing with more metadata, you can pass that data as user attributes. And then we run this and see if that user is able to sync. Now, once that comes back successfully, we also need to add that user not just to the default tenant, which it does automatically, but also to all the tenants that we have existing in the project. So we have a for loop here, and we, first of all, make sure that we give a role assignment to the user. So every single user that comes into Permit will have a viewer role. So this is what we're doing here. We're assigning this initial default role of a viewer to this specific user ID into a specific tenant. And as we're iterating over the tenants, we're essentially evaluating this data and pushing the data to Permit. And that's the basic logic of actually syncing the user. So we first check if the user exists. If it doesn't, then we sync the user with all the relevant data. And then if we have multiple tenants that we need to add the user to, we create a basic role assignment and we push that user into that specific tenant, or sync that user into that specific tenant. Finally, let's talk about the permission checks within the application. Those are the guards that we place inside of the code to allow us to check whether a user can or cannot perform specific actions. Now, to give you a little bit of an overview what a permit check function looks like, it's actually very simple. We call permit.check with 3 parameters. We pass in the unique user ID that we get from the current session. So the currently logged in user and their ID, that's the first thing we pass in, so we know who to check permissions for. Secondly, we pass in the action we're performing. Now, the action is what type of action we're performing on the specific resource in the application. So as you remember, we had 2 resources, meme and start meme. So that would be the actions associated with that resource, whether we can perform it. And then finally, we pass in the resource itself. So what we're performing that action on. Now, because here we're working with tenants and multi-tenancy, as part of passing in the third parameter, rather than passing the string of the resource itself, we can pass in an object where we reference the resource and we reference the specific tenant that we want to check the permissions for. Now here I have brought up one of the routes that we're using. It's called root.js and it's for start memes. And as you can see, here we have a permission, a guard that we're placing for a permit check. And here we're saying that we pull, like I mentioned, the session user ID from the current session. So this is the unique ID of that user. When I say unique ID, I mean this specific ID that we currently get and that the user has assigned to them. And then we run the permit check. We're passing in that unique ID, the action, and as I mentioned, the object where we're passing in the resource and the tenant we're checking that permission for. In this case, it's the default tenant. However, it doesn't end here. For example, here we have another one where we're passing in if we're able to star a start meme for a specific tenant. And in the same way, here if we can unstar a start meme in a specific tenant. And I've pulled in more because there's several. As I explained in the initial demo, obviously there's certain points in the app where we're checking for those permissions. So here I have one for membership. And here we're checking the type of tenant and the tenant ID that we're currently inside. And then we're seeing, all right, are we checking if the user has a member role inside of this specific tenant? So we check, can this user like a meme inside of this tenant? And then it comes back to us. In the same way, here we have permit checks for whether we can vote, for whether we can like or dislike. Now, it is very important to mention that permit should only be implemented in your backend. It's very common to make the mistake and use permit in the front end, and it will work, but actually it's not going to be guarding the way it's supposed to. All your logic that you're guarding is performed and should be performed in the backend, and permit should also be used in the backend appropriately. There are solutions, if you check out permit, and I might link the description down below, to create enforcements for the front end as well with using permit. This is completely possible, but it has to be done in a slightly different way. So make sure you're always enforcing in the backend, most commonly in your APIs. And I think at this stage in the tutorial, you're in a pretty good position to work with all the fundamentals of permit. You know how to integrate with Auth0 and therefore with any other authentication solution on the market because the process is pretty much the same. You know how to work with permit no-code editor to create our policies, build roles, resources, work with multi-tenancy. You know how to write the code to sync a user and how that logic works. You know how to check for permissions in all the places where you need to verify whether a user can and cannot perform something. So you're pretty much all good to go. But there is one last thing that I want to cover, and it's being able to work with audit logs within permit. Very often you'll find that you create a permission check and, for example, it fails. It's unauthorized. It doesn't let the user through. However, you're thinking, actually, it should pass. And then you need to debug and you need to understand what's happening. And you can do that very easily with permit audit logs. So when your PDP is running, the PDP, every time it hits an enforcement point in your application, it sends that data to the PDP, which knows of your policy that you've previously configured and is able to evaluate why the user can and cannot do something. And as soon as that evaluation takes place, an audit log is produced that you can view in the permit no-code UI. So I think a good way to show off an audit log and how to debug one is to actually have one fail and see why it has failed. So if I go into a collection, we know as a fact that I have to be a member to be able to upvote a meme, but I'm going to try and upvote a meme now. So you might be like, okay, I'm upvoting a meme and suddenly you don't have the permissions to do so. Now what we can do is we can actually go to the permit UI, we can go down on the left navigation to audit log, and what you'll notice is that all the audit logs render. And as you can see, I have been in funny memes, which is the tenant, and I tried to like a meme and I was rejected. Now, okay, right. So we know which user was rejected. We know the timestamp. We know what action I tried to perform, which all makes sense. The decision was denied. So I can click on this specific audit log and I can look inside of it. And here, what permit does really well is it gives you a human readable reason of what happened. So rather than trying to decrypt the log here we have a reason that states the user with this unique identity does not match any rule that grants him the like permission of the given resource of type meme. And if we want to further understand this, we don't have the like permission on meme as the viewer. And if we want to further understand it, if we go into our policy editor and we are the viewer and we look at the meme resource, well, actually, yes, we don't have the like permission for that meme. So we're unable to actually like the meme. But now in the case of understanding this, we know that we have to join as member, we can join the group, and then we can proceed to like the meme. And you can see we have been able to like the meme. And if we go into the audit logs, and you can see here that this user wanted to like a meme inside of the funny memes tenant was permitted. So that is how you can really easily evaluate what is going on in your application. Now, I think this is a good place to wrap up. If you have any questions about the project, please write your comments down in the description. We at Permit make sure that we look at the comments very consistently and we'll get back to you very, very quickly. If not, you can always join the community of thousands of authorization fanatics, as I like to call it, or in other words, other companies that are using Permit to implement this solution inside of their applications. And you can chat to everyone and ask for best practices. In order to do so, you can follow the Slack link in the description below. So I hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.